I didn't disappear because I hated him. I disappeared because I was afraid of the life waiting for me.
The gun hit the concrete floor of the warehouse before Marcus Voss even understood what his own hands had done. It landed with a sharp metallic crack that echoed off the frozen walls, and every man in that room went completely still. The three men kneeling on the ground with their wrists bound behind them stopped breathing. Reed Callahan, standing against the far wall with his arms crossed, stopped breathing. Even the two guards posted at the loading dock doors went rigid, their eyes fixed on the weapon lying on the floor, and then slowly, cautiously moving up to the face of the man who had dropped it. Marcus Voss did not drop things. In 15 years of running the most powerful criminal organization in the Midwest, in 15 years of violence and negotiation, and the kind of ruthless precision that had buried three rival families and kept the Chicago streets quiet through sheer force of reputation, Marcus Voss had never once lost his grip on anything. Not a weapon, not a deal, not a room full of men who feared him more than they feared God. He was standing perfectly still now, his phone pressed against his ear, his face the color of old ash. The call had lasted 40 seconds. He had not spoken a single word after the first two. She is here. Reed watched his boss from across the room and felt something he had not felt in 12 years working for this man. He felt afraid, not of Marcus, for him. Marcus bent slowly and picked the gun up from the floor. He holstered it without looking down. He turned to Reed and said only 3 words, "Finish this up." Then he walked toward the loading dock doors and disappeared into the Chicago night before Reed could form a single question. Outside, the cold hit him like a wall. January in Chicago was not weather. It was a presence, something that pressed against you, got into your lungs, reminded you that the world did not particularly care whether you were comfortable. Marcus stood beside his car for a moment, with his hand flat on the cold roof, not moving, just breathing. She was alive. After 6 months of nothing, after 6 months of dead ends and cold trails, in the particular madness that comes from searching an entire country for a woman who did not want to be found, she was alive. She was in a hospital 40 minutes away. She was a Lawmayan, she was 5 months pregnant, and every calculation he had made about the past half year had just been destroyed in 40 seconds by a phone call from a doctor he had never met. He got in the car, he drove. 6 months earlier, it had ended in a kitchen. Elena Harlow had been in Marcus Voss's life for 14 months before the night that ended everything, or the night she decided it would end, because there is a difference between those two things, and it matters more than most people would think. 14 months of a relationship that existed in the space between two worlds that should never have touched. She had come into his orbit the way rare things sometimes do, sideways and unexpectedly at a charity event in the Gold Coast, where she had been hired to stand near a display of luxury watches, and he had been there for reasons that had nothing to do with watches. She had looked at him without flinching. That was the first thing he noticed. Most people looked away from Marcus Voss. Lena Harlow had looked directly at him with gray eyes that had suggested she had already sized up the room and found most of it unworthy of her full attention. He had found that remarkable. 14 months. Long enough to know each other in the deep way that people know each other when the ordinary social performances have fallen away. Long enough for her to have seen things about him that he did not show to anyone else. Long enough for him to have understood that she was in some fundamental and irreplaceable way a person of unusual courage, which made it worse when she left, because he knew she had the courage to do it. He just could not understand why she had decided she needed to. The night in the kitchen, he had told himself the story 100 different ways in the months after she disappeared. A man had broken into their home. The man had been armed. The man had been sent by a rival organization to deliver a message, and the message had been written in violence, and Marcus had answered it in kind. He had done what he had always done. He had protected what was his. He had not thought in the moment about Elena standing in the doorway of the kitchen in her robe with a glass of water in her hand. He had not thought about what she was seeing. He had thought only about the threat in front of him, the way he had been trained to think, the way 15 years of this life had conditioned him to respond. Threat, response, silence. When it was over, he had turned around and she was still standing there. The glass was still in her hand. She had not dropped it, which he thought even then said something about the kind of woman she was. She had looked at him across the kitchen floor, and her face had been utterly unreadable, and he had said something like, "It is over, you are safe," and she had nodded once. 3 days later, she was gone. No note, no phone call, no forwarding address. She had taken a single bag of clothes, her passport, and approximately $200 in cash that she had pulled from the tip jars she kept on the kitchen counter. She had left everything else: her modeling portfolio, her laptop, 3 suitcases of clothing, a life she had built in that penthouse over 14 months. She had left it all because she needed to travel light and she needed to travel fast, and she had understood in the 3 days between the kitchen and her departure that the only currency that would keep her free was invisibility. He had not understood any of that then. He understood it now. She was 40 miles outside Indianapolis. She had been there for 11 weeks. Never mind. Before that, a diner in Columbus, Ohio for 9 weeks. Before that, a truck stop outside Dayton for 6 weeks. She kept moving, not always far, just far enough. She had learned things about surviving invisibly that she had not known before. She had learned that cash was freedom, and that freedom required sacrifice. She had learned that the cheapest motels asked the fewest questions, and that if you paid in advance and kept your room clean, they generally left you alone. She had learned that if you wore your hair differently and kept your eyes down and answered to whatever name you had given at the start of the job, most people did not look hard enough to see what was underneath. What was underneath these days was a woman 5 months pregnant who had been eating approximately one real meal per day for the past 3 months because she was saving money with the focused, slightly desperate logic of someone who understood that the savings were not for her. They were for the child. Every dollar she did not spend on herself was a dollar that might matter later when the baby came, when the hospital bills arrived, when the particular arithmetic of survival required her to have more than she had spent. She was aware that this logic was not entirely sound. The free clinic doctor in Columbus had told her at the 4-month appointment she had managed to get on a sliding scale that she needed to eat more and rest more and reduce her stress levels. Elena had thanked her and walked out and bought a gas station sandwich and a banana and eaten them on a bench outside and called it a victory. She was a practical person. She had always been practical. The practicality was what had made her a successful model, what had allowed her to navigate an industry that chewed through less pragmatic people without much sentiment. She had understood from the beginning that beauty was a resource with a limited shelf life, and she had managed it accordingly, saved her money, built relationships that were not contingent on how she looked that week. She had been doing well by the specific measures she had set for herself before Marcus Voss had appeared at a charity event and looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in the room. That was the problem with Marcus. He had always looked at her like that, like she was worth paying attention to. She had not been prepared for how much that would matter. The diner was busy on a Tuesday evening. Truckers and families and a few regulars who sat at the counter and ordered the same things they always ordered and asked no questions about the quiet waitress with the loose uniform who moved between tables with a kind of careful grace. She was always slightly aware of where the exits were. 6 months of running had made that automatic. She was refilling coffee at table 4 when the cramp hit. It was not the first. She had been having what she told herself were Braxton Hicks contractions for the past 2 weeks. The kind the clinic pamphlet described as practice contractions, harmless, the body preparing itself. She had been treating them accordingly, breathing through them, letting them pass, continuing with the business of being invisible in Indiana. This one did not pass. She stood with one hand on the edge of table 4 and the coffee pot in the other and breathed the way the pamphlet said to breathe and waited for the tightening across her abdomen to release. Table 4's occupant, an older man in a Carhartt jacket, was looking at her with the expression people get when they are not sure whether to say something or pretend they have not noticed. She gave him the smile she had perfected over the past 6 months, the one that said, "Everything is fine, I am fine, there is nothing here that requires your attention." The smile did not work this time. The way her knuckles had gone white on the edge of the table told a different story. She made it 3 steps toward the back of the diner before her legs stopped cooperating. The floor came up fast. She heard the coffee pot shatter somewhere behind her. She heard voices, multiple voices, the words overlapping in a way that her brain could not quite organize into sentences. She was aware, even as the world tilted sideways, of a sharp and specific frustration. Not here. Not like this. Not with witnesses who might call the wrong people, or asked the wrong questions, or put her name in a system somewhere. Her hand found her stomach before everything went dark. Just a reflex, just the first and deepest instinct she had developed over the past 5 months. Whatever else was happening, the baby was the priority. The baby was always the priority. She did not hear the ambulance arrive. She did not hear Sal, the owner of the diner, a 58-year-old man with a voice like gravel and an unexpected degree of genuine care for the employees. He generally pretended to be indifferent, to tell the paramedics that she had been working doubles all week and had not eaten anything in his presence that day. She did not hear any of it. She woke up to the sound of machines, the specific language of hospital monitoring equipment, the beep and hiss of systems designed to translate a human body into data points. The fluorescent light above her was the particular white of medical settings everywhere. The smell was antiseptic, and something underneath it that was harder to name, something institutional and slightly stale. Elena opened her eyes. Her hand went to her stomach immediately. Still there, still round, still present. She pressed her palm flat against the fabric of the hospital gown and then turned her head toward the machine beside the bed and found what she was looking for. Two lines, two separate rhythms, hers and the smaller, faster one that had become, over the past 5 months, the most important sound in her world. The baby was fine. She let herself feel that for a moment. Just sat with the relief of it, the way it moved through her like warm water dissolving something that had been wound tight in her chest for longer than she could accurately measure. Then the relief passed, and the rest of her situation reasserted itself, and she turned her attention to the room. Mercy Regional Hospital. A smaller facility, the kind that served rural counties. The room was standard issue, a single window showing a parking lot and a gray Indiana sky. A chair beside the bed that no one was currently sitting in. The door opened and a woman in a white coat entered. Mid-50s, professional bearing. She had dark circles under her eyes and the expression of someone who had been running on inadequate sleep for longer than was healthy. Elena watched her come in with focused attention. The white coat, the clipboard, the way her eyes moved across the room before they landed on Elena, which was the movement of someone who had been thinking about this moment before she walked through the door. I am Dr. Sylvia Wren. You collapsed at work. You are at Mercy Regional, just outside Indianapolis. Her voice was measured and calm and contained something underneath it that Elena could not immediately name. You are severely malnourished and dehydrated. The baby is fine. Both heart rates are stable. Elena said, "How much do I owe?" It was not a question. It was a reflex, the same reflex that had governed the past 6 months. What does this cost? What does this require from me? Dr. Wren set the clipboard down on the foot of the bed and looked at her for a moment. "Ms. Harlow," she said, "from your ID, is there anyone we should contact? Family? The father?" "No." The word came out flat and final, the kind of no that was not an opening to negotiation. Dr. Wren studied her with those dark circled eyes for a long moment. "We need to keep you overnight. You are severely malnourished for a woman at your stage of pregnancy. We are going to get fluids and nutrients into you through the IV. We need to monitor both you and the baby." Elena nodded. She was already calculating. One night, and then she could leave. She would need to find a new town after this, a new diner, a new name. The hospital would have records. Records were connections. Connections were how people found you. What she did not see, because she had closed her eyes and was running the logistics of disappearing again, was Dr. Sylvia Wren leaving the room and pausing in the hallway outside. She did not see the doctor stand there for 30 seconds. That felt like much longer, her hand flat against the wall, and her expression stripped of its professional composure. She did not see the calculation happening behind those tired eyes, the weighing of things. There was a photograph in Dr. Wren's office. She had put it there herself 3 months ago in the back of her desk drawer, under a stack of insurance paperwork, in the specific way you put something somewhere that you are hoping you will never need to find again. A man had come to the hospital and asked to speak with her privately. He had shown her the photograph and given her a number to call. He had been polite in the way that powerful men are sometimes polite, which is to say that the politeness itself was a kind of pressure. She had understood immediately that he was not a person you refused without consequences. She had taken the photograph and the number and said she understood, and the man had left. She had also taken something else during that visit, something she had not told anyone about. Not the man with the photograph, not her colleagues, not the administrator who had signed off on a routine patient records request from an outside party. She had received a sealed envelope from an elderly man named Frank Caruso, who had come through her office 1 week before the man with the photograph presenting himself as a medical records consultant. He had been soft-spoken and deliberate, and he had asked her to file a sealed physical document inside the patient file of a woman named Elena Harlow, should that name ever appear in the hospital system. He had given her enough money to matter and not enough to make her feel like she had been purchased. He had said only that the document was important and that its safety depended on it being where no one would think to look. He had said the best hiding place in the world is a patient file in a hospital that treats common people for common problems. Nobody with power looks there. They look everywhere else. She had filed it. She had not opened it. She had filed it and gone back to her work in her daughter's mounting medical bills, in the particular daily calculus of a woman trying to hold too many things together with not enough hands. Her daughter was 14 years old and had been diagnosed with a cardiac condition at 11 that required a surgical procedure their insurance had denied 3 times. The man with the photograph had offered enough to cover the remaining surgical costs and a year of follow-up care and leave something left over. She stood in the hallway outside room 314 and thought about her daughter. She thought about Elena Harlow lying in that bed. She thought about the 2 heartbeats on the monitor. Then she made the call. Marcus covered the 40 miles between Chicago and Mercy Regional in a time that was not legal and that he would not later be able to accurately reconstruct. He was aware of lights and road and the cold dark pressing in from all sides. He was aware of something happening in his chest that he did not have good vocabulary for. He had trained himself over 15 years to process things quickly and dispassionately, to strip situations down to their operational components and move through them with efficiency. He was trying to do that now. She is 5 months pregnant. He kept running into that sentence. He would start processing, start building the structure of a response, and then the sentence would be there again, and the structure would collapse. 5 months. The math was simple. The math was brutal. The math meant that she had known or suspected or discovered the truth somewhere in those early weeks of her disappearance, and she had kept running anyway. She had chosen 6 months of sleeping in cheap motels, in working 14-hour shifts at diners, and eating 1 meal a day over telling him. Over coming back. He parked in a no parking zone in front of the hospital entrance and did not look at the sign. He walked through the automatic doors and past the reception desk with the quality of movement that communicated clearly and without aggression that he was not here to ask permission from anyone. A security guard started to stand up from his chair and then appeared to reconsider. Dr. Wren was waiting by the nurse's station. She recognized him from 3 months ago, the same way you recognize a weather system. Not by its features, but by what it carries with it. Room 314, she said. She does not know you are coming. He handed her an envelope without looking at it. He walked down the corridor. He had not thought about what he was going to say. He was aware distantly that this was unusual for him. Marcus Voss generally knew what he was going to say before he walked into a room. He prepared. He considered angles. He anticipated responses and prepared for them. He had nothing. He had 40 seconds of a phone call and 40 miles of dark highway and a feeling in his chest like something had cracked open that he was going to have difficulty closing again. He pushed the door to room 314 open. She was asleep, or she appeared to be asleep. She was lying on her side facing the window. The gray Indiana sky framed in the glass behind her, the monitor beside her tracking 2 separate rhythms in lines of pale green light. She looked smaller than he remembered. Not fragile exactly. Elena was not a fragile person, but diminished in the way that people are diminished when their bodies have been running on less than they need for too long. There was a new sharpness to her face bone defining itself more clearly beneath the skin. His child was the second heartbeat on that monitor. He stood in the doorway and felt with a clarity that surprised him the full weight of 6 months of not knowing. He had told himself during those months that the not knowing was what drove him. The uncertainty, the possibility that something terrible had happened to her. But standing here now, looking at her in this hospital bed in Indiana, he understood that what he had been carrying was not uncertainty. It was grief. He had been grieving her while she was still alive, and now she was here, and the grief had nowhere to go. and what was left in its place was something rawer and less manageable. Her eyes opened. She went through several things in rapid succession. He could see them moving across her face. Recognition, shock, then something that contracted and hardened into fear. Then underneath the fear, a second layer that was more complicated, something she was working to keep from the surface. She started to sit up, the IV line pulled against her arm. How? Her voice was hoarse. The word came out rough. How did you? He came into the room and let the door close behind him. He did not move toward the bed. He stayed where he was, giving her the distance of the room between them. The doctor called me. Her expression changed. Her eyes went to the door to the window, measuring and calculating in the way he recognized now as a habit she had developed over the past 6 months. She was looking for a way out, even here, even attached to an IV in a hospital bed in Indiana. You have been here the whole time, he said. Indiana. I moved around. She said it like she was answering a question at a job interview. Steady, contained. She was watching him with those gray eyes, the way you watch something you have decided is a threat. He had told himself on the drive here that when he found her, he would need answers. He had imagined her defensive. He had imagined her defiant. He had imagined various versions of this room and this moment. He had not imagined what he did next, which was to pull the chair beside her bed close and sit down in it and lean forward with his elbows on his knees and look at her and say, tell me about the past 6 months. She stared at him. The expression on her face shifted into something between suspicion and surprise. Wow. Because I need to understand. His voice came out lower and rougher than he intended. Because for 6 months I have been losing my mind trying to figure out what I did wrong. He stopped, started again more carefully. Because you are carrying my child, and I missed 5 months of it, and I need to understand how we got here. She was quiet for a long time, then she started talking. She did not look at him at first. She talked to the window to the gray skishme. She told him about the bus ticket she had bought with $20 in cash at the Greyhound station on West Harrison Street. She told him about the motel 3 states away where she had stayed for 2 weeks, sleeping in her clothes on top of the bedspread, jumping at every sound the ice machine made. She told him about the positive pregnancy test she had taken 6 weeks after leaving, sitting on the tile floor of a gas station bathroom in Columbus, staring at 2 pink lines with the feeling of a person who has just understood that the plan they had is no longer sufficient. She told him what she had decided in that gas station bathroom. She was going to keep the baby. She was not going to contact him. She was going to find a way to do this on her own, because the alternative was going back, and going back meant the kitchen again, and the kitchen again meant raising a child inside a life where violence was not an emergency but a climate. She told him about the jobs, the diner in Columbus, the truck stop outside Dayton. She told him about sleeping in her car twice when the cost of motels did not work out in the motel's favor. She told him about the free clinic in Columbus and the nurse who had given her a bag of prenatal vitamins and 3 minutes of genuine human kindness that Elena had replayed in her head more times than she could count. She told him about being afraid. Not of violence specifically, not of being found, though that fear was constant. She told him about the deeper fear, the one that had woken her at 3 in the morning in a series of interchangeable motel rooms with her hand on her stomach and her heart running fast. The fear that she had made a terrible mistake, that the courage she had thought she was exercising was actually something smaller and more selfish, that a child deserved a father, even a complicated one, and that she had made a unilateral decision about someone else's future without any real right to do so. She had not resolved that fear. She had just kept moving. When she finished, she finally looked at him. Her face was steady. She had not cried during any of it, which told him something about what the past 6 months had required of her. He sat with everything she had told him for a moment. Let it settle. Then he said simply, the night in the kitchen. That is why. Not a question. He already knew, but he needed to hear her confirm it. She looked at him with those gray eyes. Yes. The man would have hurt you. The man had come there specifically for that purpose. I know. She said it without inflection. I know he would have. And I know that is the reality you live in, where people come into your home to hurt the people you care about. Her hand moved on her stomach. That is exactly what I cannot do to my child. He thought about arguing. He did not argue. He thought about what she had just told him, about a gas station bathroom in Columbus and a woman alone on a tile floor with a pregnancy test and a $200 savings account in a decision she had made entirely by herself in the silence of a person who has no one to consult. She had been alone for 6 months. She had eaten one meal a day for 3 months because she was saving the money for the baby. She had slept in her car. She had done all of this rather than call him. He stayed in the chair. He did not tell her what to do. He did not present her with a plan. He asked her what she needed medically immediately. He asked about the prenatal appointments she had managed to get. He asked practical questions, the way you ask practical questions when you are trying to give someone the specific dignity of being treated like an adult rather than a problem to be solved. She answered them, still carefully, still watching him with the attention of someone who has been surprised by not getting what they expected. Marcus did not leave. That was the thing she had not prepared for. She had prepared in the hours between arriving at the hospital and waking up to find him in the doorway various scenarios. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for the cold, controlled version of fury that she had seen him deploy at business associates who had disappointed him. She had prepared for demands. She had not prepared for him to sit in the chair beside her bed and ask her to tell him what the past 6 months had been like. The night progressed. A nurse came in to check her vitals to replace the saline bag. Elena submitted to this with the patient exhaustion of someone who had no remaining energy for resistance. Marcus stayed in the chair. She did not tell him to leave. At some point, she slept. The last thing she was aware of was the chair beside the bed still occupied and the monitor still tracking 2 separate rhythms and the winter dark pressing against the window. She woke at 3 in the morning. The room was quiet except for the machines. The parking lot light outside the window made a small orange rectangle on the wall. Elena lay still for a moment, orienting herself, running the half-automatic check she had run every morning for 6 months. Where am I? What are the exits? What does today require of me? Then she turned her head. He was still in the chair. His elbows were on his knees and his head was in his hands, and he was not asleep. She could tell by the quality of the stillness. He was awake in the way that people are awake at 3 in the morning when they have been awake for a long time and have spent that time thinking about things that do not resolve. She looked at him for a moment. The Marcus Voss she had known had been a person who filled rooms, not through volume or performance, but through a quality of presence that made other people rearrange themselves around him. He had always known where he was in space. He had always known exactly what was happening and what would happen next. The man in the chair at 3 in the morning looked like someone who did not know what would happen next. She said, "You stayed." He lifted his head. His eyes found hers across the small distance of the room. "Yes," he said. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she said, "I am not coming back to the penthouse. Not to what that was." He was quiet. "If I come with you," she let the sentence sit there unfinished deliberately. "If I come with you, things are different. I need to know what is happening. I need to be part of decisions. I am not going to be someone you keep safe in a locked room while the world happens somewhere I am not allowed to see." She heard him breathe, a slow breath, the kind that is managing something. "And I need you to understand." She turned her head to look at him again. "The baby is not a hostage. She is not leverage for whatever it is you need from me. She is the reason I am willing to have this conversation at all, but she is not your card to play." He met her eyes. His face was working through a series of responses, none of them the reflexive armor she was used to seeing there. He said, "I understand. I am not sure you do." She said it without cruelty, just accurately, "But I am willing to see." That was the difference, not forgiveness, not a return to what they had been. Something new, something that required different things from both of them. She was willing to see if those different things were possible. He asked quietly whether she would come back to Chicago with him. Not to the penthouse. He would make other arrangements. Somewhere that felt less like his world and more like neutral ground, at least until they could figure out what the next steps looked like. She was quiet for a long time. The 2 heartbeats on the monitor kept their steady rhythm. Then she said, "Okay, not yes to everything, just okay to the next conversation." He nodded. He understood the distinction. Outside, the winter dark had reached its deepest point. The temperature had dropped 1 final degree, and the night held itself still over Indiana. Inside room 314, Elena closed her eyes again and let herself sleep. The man who had spent 6 months searching for her sat in the chair beside her bed, and for once in 15 years did not already know what would happen next. Neither did she. That was either the most terrifying thing in the world or the beginning of something real. The house Marcus found was not the penthouse. That was the first thing Elena noticed when the car turned off the highway and onto a private road that wound through bare winter trees toward a low stone structure set back from the road behind an iron gate. It was not the penthouse in the same way that a river is not the ocean. Both are water. Both run deep. But one of them does not make you feel like you are standing at the edge of something with no bottom. The house was north of Chicago. It had been built in the 1940s by someone who understood that real security was not about height or glass. It sat on 2 acres of dormant January lawn with old oak trees at the perimeter, in a detached garage, in a garden that had gone to its winter bones. It looked like the kind of house where a family had lived for 3 generations. It looked like somewhere a person might actually inhabit. Elena stepped out of the car and stood in the cold for a moment and looked at it. She did not say anything. But something in her posture changed some fraction of the constant readiness she carried in her shoulders, and Marcus noticed it and did not remark on it, which was its own kind of intelligence. The inside had been prepared. There were groceries in the kitchen, real groceries, the kind that represented actual meals. There were fresh towels in the bathroom. The bedroom had a view of the back garden and the oak trees, and beyond them, the flat gray of the Midwest winter sky. Reed Callahan had arranged all of it. She met him properly for the first time that evening, a man in his early 40s with the look of someone who had spent enough years doing difficult things that the difficulty had become simply the texture of his life. He had light eyes and a careful manner, and he spoke to Elena with a directness she appreciated because it did not contain the condescension that powerful men's associates often directed at the women in powerful men's lives. He spoke to her like she was a person in the room. The first week passed in a kind of provisional quiet. Elena slept more than she had in 6 months, which her body apparently required, and which she submitted to with pragmatic acceptance. She ate 3 meals a day, which felt extravagant in a way that shamed her slightly, the shame being a leftover from the months of deliberate deprivation. She went to a prenatal appointment at a private clinic in the city, accompanied by Audrey Sloan, a composed woman in her early 40s who worked for Marcus in a capacity that Elena had not yet fully mapped, but that seemed to involve knowing where everything was and remaining calm regardless of what that everything turned out to be. The baby was fine, 6 months along now. Strong heartbeat, good position. The doctor told her to continue eating well and to reduce her stress levels. Elena had almost laughed at that one. Marcus was present and he was not. He moved through the house with a new deliberateness she had not seen in him before. He did not crowd her. He did not make decisions on her behalf. He asked where he would previously have directed. It was not a perfect transformation, and she was not looking for a perfect transformation. She was looking for evidence that the attempt was real. She had not decided yet whether it was. What she had decided in the nights when she lay awake listening to the house settle and the oak trees move in the winter wind was that she had not been wrong to leave. She wanted to be clear with herself about that because there was a version of this story in which coming back meant admitting that leaving had been a mistake, and she did not believe that. She had left because she had seen something that she needed to be away from. She was back because she had decided in a hospital room in Indiana at 3 in the morning that running was not the same as solving. She had confused those two things for 6 months. She was trying to stop. It was on the 8th day that Reed came to the kitchen, where Elena was sitting with a cup of tea and a prenatal vitamin, and the expression of a man delivering information he would rather not have. "There is something you should know," he said. He sat down across from her without being asked. He told her about Nikolai Breskov. Breskov had been operating in the Eastern European criminal networks for 20 years before he had moved significant resources into the United States. He was Russian by birth and Chicago by ambition, and his ambition had been pressing against the edges of Marcus's territory for the better part of a year. There had been incidents, shipments intercepted, associates approached with offers that were really ultimatums in more expensive clothing. The kind of steady, patient pressure that experienced operators applied when they were planning something larger than the individual incidents suggested. The history between Marcus and Breskov was specific. 10 years ago, Breskov had attempted to broker a major arrangement that would have given him access to the distribution infrastructure Marcus controlled. Marcus had declined. The declination had been clean and final and had cost Breskov an enormous amount of money and a significant degree of standing in the networks where standing was the primary currency. Breskov had not forgotten. Men like Breskov did not forget the specific geometry of their humiliations. Elena listened to all of this without interrupting. She asked two questions when Reed finished. The first was, how long has he been watching this house? The second was, does Marcus know you are telling me this? Reed said, 3 days probably. And yes, she nodded. She looked out the kitchen window at the oak trees. Thank you for telling me, she said. After he left, she sat with her tea and thought about the 8 days she had spent in this house, believing that the provisional quiet was simply what it appeared to be. She had known in some background register that it was not. She had not lived inside Marcus Voss's world for 14 months without understanding that quiet was not the same as safe. But she had allowed herself the small comfort of the provisional version. She was done with that now. She was watching more carefully. That was how she noticed Owen Briggs. He was one of 6 guards who rotated through the house on a 12-hour cycle responsible for the exterior perimeter and the gate. She had learned their rhythms over the 8 days without consciously deciding to the way you learn the rhythms of any environment you are trying to understand. This one arrived at 7 in the morning and left at 7 in the evening. That one took his coffee black and smoked a single cigarette at 10 and 2. The older one with the scar on his jaw walked the perimeter in a pattern that was always exactly the same. Owen Briggs was 31 years old and had been with Marcus for 2 years. He was efficient and quiet and had a face that gave away nothing, which in this context was unremarkable, because most of the people in Marcus's employ had faces that gave away nothing. What Owen Briggs had that the others did not was a very small, very specific habit. He checked his phone. Not obviously. Not in the careless way that people check their phones when they are bored. He checked it in the deliberate, guarded way that people check a device they do not want observed, angling his body away from the room, holding the phone below the natural sight line, glancing at it for exactly the amount of time it took to read a short message, and then returning it to his pocket in one fluid motion. Elena had seen it 4 times in 3 days before she understood why it bothered her. It bothered her because she recognized it. She had spent 6 months being the person in the room who was doing something they could not afford to have noticed. She knew the muscle memory of concealment. She knew the attention a person deployed when they were managing a secret in a room full of people. She had developed a sensitivity to it, the way you develop sensitivity to sounds when you have spent long enough in the dark. Owen Briggs was managing a secret. She did not go to Marcus. She went to Reed. She found him in the study off the front hallway and knocked on the open door and waited for him to look up and then said, "Your man Briggs, something is wrong with him." Reed looked at her steadily. Then he said, "Tell me what you saw." She told him. She described the phone checks, the body positioning, the frequency. She described the behavior of concealment, which she acknowledged was a strange thing to describe, but was also, she believed, the most significant part of what she had observed. Reed did not dismiss her. He did not explain it away. He said, "How long?" 3 days, she said. "That I noticed. Could be longer." He nodded once. He was already reaching for his own phone. 2 hours later, while Elena was walking laps in the back garden that the doctor had recommended for circulation, she heard through the kitchen window Reed's voice saying something she could not fully make out, and then a silence with a specific character. The character of a silence that follows a confirmation. She walked her laps and did not go inside until she had finished them. Owen Briggs was removed from the property within the hour. Marcus handled it personally, which was not something Reed reported to Elena in detail, and which Elena did not ask about in detail because she understood by now the grammar of this world well enough to know that some sentences ended without the words being spoken aloud. Owen Briggs had sold them to Breskov for reasons that had not been fully established and that no longer mattered. What mattered was the information he had already passed along. That evening, Marcus found her in the garden. He came through the back door and stood beside her at the stone wall that marked the property's edge, looking out at the dormant lawn in the blue winter dusk. "You found him before we did," he said. She did not make anything of that. She said, "What happens now?" He told her. Owen Briggs had been providing Breskov with information for an undetermined period. Breskov had access to the house's layout, the security rotation schedule, and the details of their arrival 8 days ago. He knew Elena was here. He had been reporting it. Breskov knew. She stood with that for a moment, the bare oak trees at the perimeter, the winter sky going from blue to gray to something almost purple at the edges. The baby moving in the low, slow way, the baby moved in the evenings, a kind of interior presence she had grown accustomed to, in the way you grow accustomed to the most important things. "How much time do we have?" she said. Marcus said, "Not as much as I would like." She turned to look at him. His face was doing the thing she had been cataloging, the thing where the armor was present but not complete, where the man underneath was visible, in the spaces between. He was afraid, not for himself. She had come to understand over the past 8 days that Marcus Voss did not experience fear for himself in any conventional way, but he experienced it acutely and without apparent ability to suppress it or for her. She said, "Then tell me what the plan is." 3 days later, Breskov came. It was 4 in the morning on a Thursday in late January. Elena was not asleep. She had not been sleeping well for the past 3 days since the conversation at the stone wall, and she had been lying in the dark listening to the house with focused attention. She heard the first sound at 4:12. It was not loud. It was the absence of a sound that should have been there, the guard at the front of the property, who made a small scuffing noise with his boots on the gravel path every time he completed his perimeter circuit. She had learned the interval of that circuit. It was 22 minutes. The absence of the boot scuff at what her body told her was the right interval registered in her nervous system before her conscious mind had finished processing what the absence meant. She was already sitting up when the second sound came. Glass somewhere on the ground floor. Not a break. A pressure against glass. A testing. She did not call for Marcus. She did not go to the door. She went to the closet on the far wall of the bedroom where Marcus had shown her on the second day the panel. He had shown her the panic room the way a person shows someone a fire extinguisher. You hope they never need it. You make sure they know exactly where it is and exactly what to do with it. He had walked her through the code twice. He had shown her the tunnel behind the far wall of the panic room, the one that ran beneath the garden and emerged in a drainage access point at the property's edge. He had shown her the emergency bag hanging on the hook inside the door, the burner phone with 3 numbers programmed, the code phrase and response sequence for the third number. He had done all of this matter-of-factly in the voice of a man who understood that preparation was not the same as alarm. She had paid attention with the focused precision of a woman who had spent 6 months understanding that information was survival. The door of the bedroom opened, and Marcus was there already dressed, and the look on his face confirmed what she had heard downstairs. "Go," he said. She was already moving. She heard him behind her for a moment, and then she did not, because he had gone toward the stairs, and she had gone toward the closet, and those two directions were not the same direction, and the house was already filling with the charged pressure of men with weapons moving through it in the dark. The panel was where it was supposed to be. The code was the sequence Marcus had made her repeat back to him twice. She pressed the 6 digits in order. The panel released. She went through. The panic room was small and lit by cold blue light from security monitors. She had approximately 4 seconds to look at those monitors before she understood the full scope of what was happening. Multiple screens, multiple angles. The front of the house, 3 men down, 2 more moving in. The side entrance, another team moving with coordinated efficiency. The back garden clear for now, but a figure at the stone wall perimeter that was not supposed to be there told her that clear was temporary. And in the front hallway, Marcus and Reed, in the geometry of 2 men who understood that the odds were not in their favor and who had decided that was not sufficient reason to adjust their position. She watched the monitor for exactly as long as she could afford to watch it. Then she turned to the far wall. The tunnel entrance was a steel panel with a lever release. She pulled the lever. The panel swung inward on oiled hinges that made no sound. The tunnel was dark except for the low orange glow of emergency lighting strips running along the floor. Approximately 4 feet wide and slightly less than 6 feet tall. The air was cold and carried the mineral smell of earth and concrete. She took the emergency bag from the hook. She went into the tunnel. The panel swung closed behind her. She walked. The tunnel was longer than she had expected. She had been told it was approximately 60 meters, which she had understood as a number, but was now understanding as an experience. 60 meters in a concrete tunnel beneath a frozen January garden, while the house above her contained armed men, and the man who had spent 6 months searching for her was somewhere in that house, doing whatever he was doing. That was not a number. That was a long time to beat it in a tunnel with only orange strips and the sound of her own breathing for company. She was in her 6th month of pregnancy. Her center of gravity was not where it had been 6 months ago. In the normal course of a day, this was manageable. In a 4-foot-wide concrete tunnel at 4 in the morning, with adrenaline doing what adrenaline does, it was a different calculation. She fell at the 40-meter mark. The toe of her boot caught a seam in the concrete floor, and she went forward with the horrible slow-motion quality of a fall you cannot stop once it has committed to happening. She got her hands up, her palms took the concrete, her left knee took the rest. The emergency bag swung on its strap and banged against the wall. She lay still for a moment. The baby moved. That specific interior flutter that said, "I am here, I am fine, I am present." Elena put her forehead against the cool concrete floor and breathed. Then she got up. She put her hand against the wall and used it as a guide, and she walked the remaining 20 meters, and she did not fall again. The drainage access point was a steel hatch set into the floor with a latch that required both hands. She opened it. She climbed up the 6-rung ladder and pushed through the hatch into the cold above ground, dark at the property's edge, beyond the stone wall, beyond the oak trees. The cold hit her immediately. January at 4 in the morning in northern Illinois. She crouched at the property edge and opened the emergency bag. The burner phone was there. She pressed the 3rd number. It rang once, a woman's voice, "Safe house protocol. Authentication." Elena took one breath. "Nightingale," she said. "Confirmed location." She gave the address. She gave the cross street. She said, "There are multiple armed individuals at the house. I am at the drainage access at the northwest corner of the property. I do not know the status of the primary." A pause of less than 3 seconds. Vehicle en route. Black SUV, license ending 774. Driver will say morning light. You respond evening star. Do not enter any other vehicle. Stay below sight line until contact. Elena pressed herself against the fence line and waited. She waited 11 minutes. She counted them, not because the counting helped with the fear exactly, but because the counting was something to do with the part of her brain that would otherwise be spending those 11 minutes generating scenarios she could not act on. She had learned this technique in the weeks after leaving in the motel rooms in the early hours. The SUV came from the north without its headlights. It stopped at the curb 30 feet from where she was crouched, and the driver's window went down. Morning light, evening star. She got in. The driver was Audrey Sloan, which Elena had not expected. Audrey was composed and alert and driving with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this before. The first thing Elena said was, "Is he alive?" Audrey did not answer immediately, which was itself a kind of answer, and also not one. Then Audrey said, "Last confirmed contact 18 minutes ago, he was engaged. That is all I have right now." Elena looked out the window at the passing dark. She put her hand on her stomach. She said, "Where are we going?" "A safe house on the south side. Off the books. Dr. Wren is meeting us there." Elena was quiet for a moment. She understood the logistics of it. Marcus had called Dr. Wren from the car on the way to Mercy Regional 6 months ago, a contingency built into the contingency, because men like Marcus Voss did not make calls they had not already planned for. Dr. Wren had been positioned as a medical resource from the moment Marcus had decided to bring Elena back to Chicago. The betrayal and the usefulness had existed in parallel as things in this world often did. The safe house was a 2-story building in a residential neighborhood that made an unremarkable car parked outside an unremarkable building easy to overlook. Inside, it was stripped of functional. Cots, a kitchen with a percolator and canned goods, a room with communications equipment and monitors, and a medical setup in the back room that Dr. Sylvia Wren was already organizing when they arrived. Dr. Wren examined her without discussion. The baby was fine. Elena's knee was bruised but not damaged. Her blood pressure was elevated and came down over 20 minutes as the adrenaline cleared. Dr. Wren said, "You are going to feel this tomorrow." Elena said, "I know." It was 6 in the morning, and the sky outside the safe house windows was going from black to the dark gray of a winter Chicago dawn when Reed Callahan came through the door. He had a cut above his left eye and a quality about him that Elena had not seen before. Not shaken exactly. He was not a man who shook easily, but altered, like something had happened that had cost him something, and he was still in the process of determining what. He is alive, Reed said, before Elena could ask. He is injured. He is en route. How injured? Reed met her eyes. He will need Dr. Wren. She sat with that. Marcus came through the door 40 minutes later, and she understood immediately the scope of what Reed had been managing her expectations for. He had taken damage to his ribs, at least one cracked, and possibly two. There was a cut along his jaw that had been closed with medical tape applied by someone who was not a doctor. He moved with the careful quality of a man who has learned exactly how much he can move without making existing damage worse. He came through the door, and he found her immediately across the room, and something in his face changed. She crossed to him before she had finished deciding to. She put her hand against his uninjured side carefully and looked at his face. He said, "You made it out." "Yes." "The tunnel." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at her abdomen. She watched him process the information of her being there intact, both of them intact, and whatever that information did to him, it moved through his face like weather. Dr. Wren took him into the back room. Elena sat in the communications room and watched the monitors. The house had been secured. The situation had been resolved. She did not ask for specifics. What was offered 2 hours later was new information that changed the shape of everything. Breskov had a failsafe. Reed explained it in the flat voice of someone delivering information they would prefer not to have to deliver. Breskov had spent the past 18 months systematically recording his dealings with every major criminal operation in Chicago. Meetings, transactions, conversations. He had built a comprehensive archive of evidence sufficient to put multiple people away for multiple decades, himself included, packaged to be released to the FBI automatically if he died. A dead man's switch. 72 hours after his last confirmed check-in, the archive would transmit to federal servers and to 3 separate journalists with established track records for handling exactly this kind of material. Breskov had been dealt with in the early hours of the morning. The 72-hour clock was running. They had a server location. Breskov's technical infrastructure was operated out of an office building in the Loop 15th floor, accessed by Breskov's personal biometrics. Reed had obtained those biometrics through means Elena did not ask about, and that the cooler one of the men carried with excessive care confirmed. They had one attempt. If the system detected unauthorized access at the biometric level, it would trigger immediate transmission. The fail-safe had multiple passwords protecting the abort sequence. They had 47 minutes from the point they accessed the server before the next transmission window opened. Elena said, "Let me come." Marcus said, "Absolutely not." She looked at him across the room where he was sitting with his cracked ribs and the medical tape on his jaw, in the quality of a man who had been awake for more than 24 hours. She said, "You have 47 minutes in a system you do not know how to crack." She said it without drama. Just as a statement of operational reality, you need every resource you have. I am a resource. A silence. Then Reed said quietly from the corner, "She found Briggs before we did." Marcus looked at his second in command. Then he looked at Elena. The calculation she could see him running was not about her safety, or not only about that. It was about whether she was right, whether she was actually a resource, whether the practical reality of the situation overrode the impulse to keep her in the room with the cots and the percolator. She let him run the calculation. She did not press. He said, "You stay with Reed at all times." She said, "Agreed." The Loop building was a 22-story glass and concrete structure that housed logistics offices on its lower floors, and on its 15th floor, the kind of unremarkable corporate space that served as infrastructure for things that were not unremarkable at all. They went up in an elevator that smelled of carpet cleaner and commercial anonymity. Reed had the cooler. Marcus moved with the deliberateness of a man managing pain he was not going to mention. The 15th floor was empty at this hour. The server room was at the end of a corridor behind a door with a biometric scanner that accepted what Reed provided and released the lock with a sound that felt like the most expensive click in the room. The room was cold. Server rooms always were. The equipment occupied 4 racks against the far wall. lights blinking in the patient rhythm of systems running their processes without awareness of the clock that was now at 41 minutes. The main screen was active. Reed sat down and began working. He had brought a technician, a young man named Garrett, who had the combination of anxiety and speed that marked people who were very good at their work and very aware of what would happen if their work failed. Garrett's fingers were already moving across a secondary keyboard. 34 minutes. The system had 4 password layers protecting the abort sequence. Reed and Garrett had cleared 2 of them. The third had stopped them. It was not a word or a number. It was a combination, and the combination was not following any of the patterns that Garrett's tools were designed to exploit. It required something personal, something specific to Breskov that was not in any record they had found. 22 minutes. Elena was standing very still. She was looking at the screen at the cursor blinking in the password field, and she was not thinking about the room or the men in it or the clock. She was thinking about a Tuesday afternoon 4 years ago in a photography studio on Michigan Avenue. She had been booked for a full-day commercial shoot for a company whose client list she had not known at the time included the holding company that served as the visible face of Nikolai Breskov's legitimate business interests. She had been there for 8 hours. In the afternoon, there had been a period of 2 hours while equipment was reconfigured, during which Elena had been given access to a green room off the main studio. The green room had a couch and a coffee machine and a bulletin board with photographs pinned to it. The photographs had been personal. A man in his 50s at a beach somewhere. The same man at what appeared to be a child's birthday party. The same man with a young girl, maybe 8 years old, dark hair on a boardwalk somewhere on the East Coast. The girl's name had been written in marker at the bottom of one of the photographs, in the way people write names on photographs that are meant for family, not for files. The handwriting had been large and slightly unsteady, the handwriting of a man who was more comfortable with power than with sentiment. Vera. 16 minutes. Elena said, "Try Vera." Reed looked up at her. She said his daughter. She is or was approximately 12 years old. Dark hair. He had her photographs on a bulletin board in his private studio space on Michigan Avenue. "I saw them 4 years ago on a commercial shoot." The name was written on the photograph. Garrett was already typing. The cursor blinked. 13 minutes. The screen changed. Another layer opened a confirmation request with 2 fields. Garrett worked through it in 90 seconds, his hands moving with the speed of someone who has just understood that the door has opened. 9 minutes. The abort sequence loaded. 7 minutes and 32 seconds remaining when Garrett entered the final confirmation, and the screen went from red to the green of a transmission that had been stopped. The archive was not going anywhere. The clock was not a clock anymore. The room went quiet except for the server's patient hum. Reed sat back. Garrett put his hands flat on the desk and breathed. Marcus behind them was very still. Elena looked at the green screen and thought about a bulletin board in a green room on Michigan Avenue 4 years ago. She thought about an 8-year-old girl with dark hair. She thought about the randomness of information, the way things you witness, without understanding their significance, settle into memory and stay there available until the moment arrives when they become the most important thing in the room. 6 months of survival had required her to pay attention. She had been paying attention long before that. Marcus turned to look at her. She met his eyes. Something moved through his expression that she had no name for and did not try to name. She simply held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the green screen. They left the building separately by different exits and reconvened at a parking structure 3 blocks south. It was nearly 10 in the morning and Chicago was awake around them, the ordinary machinery of a Thursday proceeding without any awareness of what had just not happened in a server room 15 floors above street level. In the parking structure, Marcus stood beside a concrete pillar and looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at Elena. He did not say thank you. The category did not seem adequate to what had just happened, and he apparently understood that. He said, "The house is gone. We need somewhere else." She said, "I know." He said, "There is a property outside the city. It has not been connected to my name in any documentation. Breskov's people did not know about it." She said, "All right." He said, "You do not have to." She looked at him steadily. She said, "I am not running." It was the first time she had said it directly. In the hospital in Indiana, she had said okay, which was a beginning but not a commitment. In the 8 days at the house, she had said she was willing to see, which was contingent and observational. This was different. This was a statement of fact delivered without drama, without performance. She was not running. They drove out of the city as the morning traffic built around them. Elena sat in the back seat and watched Chicago move past the windows, the lake appearing between buildings to the east, gray and vast and indifferent, the way large bodies of water are indifferent to the small dramas of the people who live beside them. The property was northwest of the city, past the suburban sprawl where the landscape opened into the flat fields of the Illinois countryside, bare in January, the soil dark under a colorless sky. The driveway was long and unpaved, and the house at the end of it was a low farmhouse that had been renovated sometime in the past decade, not expensively but well. It had the quality of a place built for function and arrived through years of use at a kind of accidental dignity. They pulled up to it as the late morning light did its best with the cloud cover. Elena stepped out of the car and stood in the cold and looked at the house and the fields beyond it. It was nothing like the penthouse. Reed came around the car and stood beside her. He said, "We have a visitor." She turned. At the end of the long driveway, just inside the gate, a black car was parked. Standing beside it were three men, and the oldest of them, a man with silver hair, and the bearing of someone who had been significant and who carried that significance lightly, now was looking toward the house with an expression Elena could not read from this distance. Reed said his name is Frank Caruso. He says Marcus's father gave him 3 addresses 15 years ago and told him that if anything ever happened and he needed to find Marcus, he should try them in order. This was the third one. He says it is urgent. He says it is about Marcus's father. The fields were very still. The January sky held itself in its gray. Elena looked at the man at the gate and then looked back at the house where Marcus had already gone inside and where everything that came next was still waiting to be determined. She said, "Let him in." Frank Caruso moved like a man who had learned somewhere in his 60-odd years that arriving slowly was a form of respect. He came up the long driveway on foot, and he walked with a slight forward lean that suggested old injuries managed rather than resolved, and he kept his hands visible at his sides in the deliberate way of someone who understood that visible hands communicated intent to people who spent their lives reading intent. Elena watched him from the window of the front room. She had positioned herself there without thinking about it, the same instinct that had governed 6 months of survival. Know who is coming before they arrive. Read them before they speak. Marcus came to stand beside her. He looked at the man coming up the driveway with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something complicated and old. The expression of a person confronting something they had filed under, finished a long time ago, and are now discovering is not finished at all. "You know him," she said. "He was my father's oldest friend." Marcus said it quietly. "I have not spoken to him in 11 years. Why?" He looked at her. Then he looked back at the window. "Because my father died and Frank disappeared." He said it was grief, that he could not be around the things that reminded him. I accepted that. A pause. I should not have accepted that. Frank Caruso came through the front door with Reed behind him, and the 2 men Frank had brought with him remaining outside at Reed's direction. He stood in the front room and he looked at Marcus for a long moment, and then he looked at Elena, and something in his expression shifted the recognition of a variable he had accounted for and was now confirming in person. He said, "You must be Elena Harlow." He said it with the directness of someone who did not believe in performing ignorance he did not have. "I have been following the situation carefully." Elena said, "How carefully?" "Carefully enough to know that you are the reason he is trying to get out." He looked at her steadily. "And carefully enough to know that the document I left in your hospital file may be the most important thing in this room." She went very still. Marcus looked at her. Frank set the briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside was a folder, but also something else. A sealed medical envelope with the letterhead of Mercy Regional Hospital in Indianapolis, Indiana. Elena's name was printed on the outside. She recognized the format immediately. She had seen dozens like it over the past months of prenatal appointments and clinic visits. It was a patient records envelope. Her name was on it. Frank said, 3 months before you arrived at that hospital, I needed to get evidence somewhere safe, somewhere that no one in this world would think to look. He looked at her steadily. I called the records department at Mercy Regional and arranged for a sealed physical document to be filed inside the patient file of a woman named Elena Harlow, should that name ever appear in their system. He paused. I did not know who you were then. I knew only the name from a contact who mentioned Marcus had been searching for someone by that name for months. I knew that a woman Marcus Voss was searching for was not someone his enemies would think to investigate. I knew her medical file in a small Indiana hospital was the last place anyone with power would look. Elena looked at the envelope with her name on it. Frank said, "You have been carrying the proof of what happened to Vincent Voss for the past 3 months. Inside a hospital file. In Indiana. Safe because no one who wanted it destroyed would ever think to look there." Marcus looked at Elena. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that was equal to it. A woman who had been running from this man's world had spent 3 months unknowingly protecting the most important secret in his family's history. She had been his father's guardian. She had not known it. There had been no plan, no choice, no intention. Just the particular randomness of a woman running far enough and a careful old man thinking clearly enough, and the two of them intersecting in the record system of a hospital in Indiana in a way that neither of them had designed. Frank opened the briefcase fully. He set the folder on the table alongside the sealed envelope. "Your father did not die in an accident," he said to Marcus. The room went very still. Marcus was sitting across from him, and his face did the thing she had learned to watch the process of managing the immediate response in order to hear the full information before reacting. She watched him do it. She watched the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, and the way his hands rested on his knees with a stillness that was effortful. Frank said Vincent was killed. It was planned and it was executed by people who understood that a staged accident was cleaner than a war. He was targeted because of what he knew and because of what he controlled and because removing him was more efficient than negotiating with him. Marcus said who? Frank told them. 15 years ago, he had been one of 3 men who understood the full scope of what Vincent Voss had discovered in the months before his death. Vincent had found evidence of a systematic operation, a coordinated effort by a coalition of operators to consolidate power in the Midwest by removing the people who would not be consolidated. Vincent had been gathering that evidence. He had been building a case he intended to use for leverage, for the specific kind of leverage that powerful men use to establish truces. He had not lived to use it. Frank had survived because he had not been in the car. He had survived and he had understood immediately that surviving was only temporary if the people who had killed Vincent knew what Frank knew. So he had disappeared. He had taken what he knew and gone somewhere not connected to the networks where his name meant anything. He had waited 11 years. He had watched Marcus build something from the ruins of what his father had left. He had watched and told himself that the time was not right, that the information he carried was not safe to deliver, that the men who had killed Vincent were still powerful enough to make the delivery fatal. Then he had watched Marcus fall in love with a woman who made him want to leave, and he had watched that woman disappear and come back. And he had watched the particular thing that happens between two people when they are trying to build something real from materials that are not designed for it. And he had decided that the time was now, because Marcus was trying to get out. And the men who had killed his father were going to see that exit as an opportunity. Frank opened the folder. There were names, there were documents, the specific materials of a case that a careful man had been assembling from safe distances for 11 years. At the bottom of the last page was a name that Marcus read in silence. Thomas Malone. He had been dead for 5 years. A cardiac event at 61. He had been a businessman of the variety that existed in the Midwest in the 1980s and 90s, where the line between legitimate enterprise and something else was managed rather than maintained. He had been successful. He had left behind a company, a reputation, and a son. Eddie Malone. Elena heard the name and watched Marcus go very still, and she understood what the name meant and why the stillness was the kind that preceded something significant. She said, "Tell me about Eddie Malone." Frank looked at her, then at Marcus, then back at her, recalibrating something about the dynamic in the room. He said, "Eddie Malone is 33 years old. He inherited his father's legitimate businesses and has spent the past 4 years building a parallel operation on top of them. He is ambitious and smart, and he has been watching the space that Marcus is vacating the way a man watches a table being cleared at a restaurant he intends to occupy." Reed had gone to the window. He said, "We already knew about him. Marcus was planning to offer him a partnership, a formal arrangement to absorb the territories under a legitimate umbrella. Clean exit for us. Recognized standing for him. Frank said, "Does he know that Marcus knows about his father?" Reed said no. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then you have a choice to make." The room held that statement. Outside the farmhouse windows, the January fields were very still under the gray sky. Elena was looking at Marcus. He was looking at the folder. His hand was resting on the page with Thomas Malone's name on it, and he was very far away from the room for a moment. She understood what the choice was. The man who killed your father is dead. The son of that man is sitting in the space you are trying to vacate, building something on the grave of what your father built. And he may not know what his father did, or he may, and either way, he is now the last significant piece of this transition. You can destroy him. You have the grounds and the means and 15 years of accumulated reason. Or you can give him the partnership and walk away. Marcus lifted his hand from the folder. He looked at Frank. He said, "Does Eddie know what his father did?" Frank said, "I believe he does not." Thomas was not the kind of man who confessed to his children. He was the kind of man who built a clean face and maintained it with particular care for the people whose opinion of him mattered. Marcus stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking out at the fields. Elena looked at the folder on the table. She looked at the last page with Thomas Malone's name. Then she looked at Marcus's back at the window. She knew this moment. She had been in versions of it herself, the moment where you can choose the story that ends with what you are owed, or the story that ends with what you want. She had been at that crossroads in a hospital room in Indiana when she had decided that coming back was not the same as giving up. She had been at it in the tunnel under the house when she had gotten up from the concrete floor and kept walking. She said, "Marcus." He turned. She said, "What do you want? Not what he deserves, not what your father is owed. What do you want?" He looked at her for a long moment. He looked like a man at the end of something very long. Not defeated, just arrived. Just standing at the place where something that has been going on for a very long time has finally reached its last room. He said, "I want to stop." She nodded. He said, "I want Ellie to grow up without knowing what this cost." She said, "Then you know what you need to do." The meeting with Eddie Malone happened 3 days later in a neutral space that Reed arranged a conference room in the offices of a legitimate logistics company that Marcus had been using as a shell for long enough that it had stopped being a shell and had become simply a company. Eddie Malone came with 2 associates and a lawyer, which said something about the kind of operator he was. He did not come to a meeting like this without accounting for the legal dimension. That was either intelligence or caution, and in Marcus's experience, the two were not mutually exclusive. Elena was not in the meeting room. She was in a waiting room adjacent to it, and the wall between them was not quite thick enough to be soundproof. She heard Marcus offer the partnership. She heard him describe the structure, the territories, the legitimate umbrella, the formal recognition that would come with it. She heard him lay out the terms with the precision of a man who has prepared this particular conversation carefully and knows exactly what he is willing to concede and what he is not. She heard Eddie Malone accept, and then she heard something that had not been in the plan that Marcus had not told her he was going to do. She heard him say, after the terms were agreed and before the lawyers began their documentation, one more thing. He said, "I knew your father." A pause. He said, "Thomas Malone and my father did business together. They were in the same world for a long time. There are things I know about that time that I have decided not to use because the past is the past and I am trying to build something that is not built on it." He said, "I am telling you this so that you know I know, and so that you know I chose differently. What your father did or did not do is between him and whatever accounting comes after a man dies. That accounting is not mine to impose, but my family is mine to protect, and what I know protects them. You understand what I am telling you?" Eddie Malone said yes. Marcus said, "Good. Then we are finished here." Elena sat in the waiting room and looked at the ceiling and thought about the courage it takes to say "I know," and I chose not to use it. She had not expected that. She had not expected him to look across a conference table at the son of the man who killed his father and hand back a weapon he had every right to deploy. She had not been prepared for that version of him. She was still sitting with it when Marcus came out of the meeting room. He looked at her. She looked at him. She stood up. She crossed the small room. She put both hands on his face, carefully mindful of the jaw that was still healing, and she looked at him directly. She said, "That was the bravest thing I have ever seen anyone do." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was the only thing that made sense." She said, "I know. That is what makes it brave." They drove back to the farmhouse in the late afternoon. The fields were going gold in the low winter light, the honest light of a landscape not trying to be anything other than what it is. That night in the farmhouse kitchen, she told Marcus about the foundation. She had been thinking about it for weeks. The specific shape of it had been forming in her mind in the way that things form when you have been through something that leaves you permanently changed, and you are trying to find the use of that change. She had spent 6 months being a pregnant woman alone and afraid, with no resources and no one to call, and the full weight of a decision she had made without adequate support pressing down on her every day. She was not the only one. She was never going to be the only one. She told him she wanted to build something for women in situations like the one she had been in. Not just pregnant women. Women who were running from something. Women who had made the decision to leave a dangerous situation and then discovered that the leaving was only the first part, that the leaving put you in a particular kind of wilderness that the world was not well organized to help you through. Women who needed prenatal care and housing and the specific practical support of someone who understood that survival required more than crisis intervention. It required continuity. She was going to call it the Harlow Foundation. Her name, not his, not Voss. She said this directly looking at him across the kitchen table because she needed him to understand that this was not a thing he was giving her. It was a thing she was building that he was being invited to support. He said, "I understand." She said, "I mean it." He said, "I know you mean it. That is why I said I understand rather than of course." She looked at him. Something in her chest moved that she did not have a word for, accumulating in small increments over the past several weeks into something she was going to have to eventually name. She said, "I am going to need funding, significant funding, and I am going to need it to be clean. It cannot come from anything that is not legitimate. I will not build this on dirty money." He said, "The legitimate businesses are profitable, more profitable than I expected, which tells you something about the efficiency differential between legal enterprise and the alternative." She said, "Dr. Wren." He looked at her. She said, "I want to fund her daughter's surgery through the foundation as the first act. I know what she did. I know she called you, but I also know why she did it, and I know what it cost her, and I know that the priesthood was not the money. The body was who she had to become for 30 seconds in a hospital hallway in Indiana." Marcus was quiet. She said, "I am not forgiving her because I am required to. I am doing it because the foundation is supposed to be about understanding what drives people to impossible choices and then doing something about the conditions that create those choices. I cannot build that and refuse to apply it to the first person who tested it." He said, "You have already decided." She said, "Yes." He said, "Then it is decided." She woke at 2 in the morning 4 days later to something that was not ambiguous. She had been awake enough times in the past weeks to know the difference between false starts and the real thing, and this was the real thing, the certainty that the body communicates without any need for interpretation. She lay still for exactly long enough to confirm it. Then she said his name. Marcus was awake before she finished saying it. He drove to the hospital with the focused quality she recognized from other contexts and found in this context oddly reassuring. He was not afraid, or he was afraid, and it was not the kind of fear that interfered with function. He held her hand at red lights. He did not run the lights. She noticed this and thought it was a small thing, and also not a small thing. The hospital was a private facility north of the city. The obstetrician who had been managing Elena's care was there, and she was the kind of doctor who made everything feel like a problem that had been solved before it was fully presented, which was exactly what Elena needed at 2 in the morning in active labor. Reed was somewhere outside. Audrey Sloan was somewhere outside. The world continued its business. None of it was in the room. The room had 2 people and the work of a human life arriving in the world, which is work that does not negotiate with the schedule or the circumstances of the people performing it. It was 8 hours. 8 hours is a long time to be in a room with someone, and a short time to be in a room with someone depending on what is happening in the room. Marcus held her hand for all of it. He did not look at his phone. He did not step out. He was there with the full presence of a person who has decided that whatever else is happening in the world, this room is where they are. She was aware in the spaces between contractions of watching him, the way he responded to the monitoring equipment with the focused attention of a man trying to understand a language he has not been taught. The way he held her hand not tightly, because tight would have been about his fear rather than her need, but steadily with a consistency that was its own form of communication. The way he did not say it will be fine because neither of them had any use for that sentence, but said instead, I am here, which was the only thing that was actually true, and therefore the only thing that was actually useful. At 11:47 in the morning, Ellie arrived, 7 pounds 3 ounces, dark hair, a voice that established itself immediately and without apology. The doctor placed her on Elena's chest, and Elena looked at her daughter for the first time. There are things you cannot prepare for. She had spent the past several months preparing for many things. She had prepared for the practical difficulties of new parenthood, the sleeplessness in the learning curve, in the chaos of an infant. She had prepared emotionally, or she had told herself she had, in the way that people prepare for things that are actually beyond the reach of preparation. She had not been prepared for this, for looking at another person who did not exist before and understanding immediately with a certainty that had no argument in it that everything you are has just reorganized itself permanently around this new center. Ellie Marie Voss, she had agreed to the last name. Not because she was a Voss in the way that Marcus was a Voss, not because she was attaching herself to what that name had meant in the world he was leaving, but because Ellie deserved to carry both of them. Because names were not just history, they were also intention. And the intention she and Marcus were building together was worth putting a name to. Marcus held Ellie 20 minutes after she was born, when the initial assessments were done and the room had settled into its new configuration. He held her with the careful attention of a man who is aware that he is holding the most important thing he has ever held and is learning in real time how to do it correctly. Elena watched him. She watched him look at his daughter, and she watched whatever happened to his face when he did, which was the kind of thing that bypassed the armor entirely and arrived directly at the person underneath. She had seen versions of it before at the hospital in Indiana when the gun hit the floor, at the conference table when he told Eddie Malone he had chosen differently. But this was not a version of those things. This was its own category. He looked at Elena over the top of Ellie's dark head. He said, thank you. She understood what he was thanking her for. Not just for Ellie, not just for the fact of her existence, for coming back, for not running when she had every reason to run, for deciding in a hospital room in Indiana at 3 in the morning that the next conversation was worth having. She said, don't thank me yet. She said it with the tone she had developed over the past weeks, the one that contained warmth and caution in equal measure. We still have a great deal of work to do. He said, I know. She said, but for today. He said, for today. On the second evening in the hospital, Reed came to the room. He knocked on the open door and waited. He said the territories are transferred. Eddie Malone has taken possession with the agreed structure in place. The legitimate businesses are fully separated from anything that preceded them. The legal team has confirmed the documentation. Marcus looked at him, then he looked at Ellie asleep in the hospital bassinet. He said, is there anything outstanding? Reed said, nothing material. There are loose ends that Audrey is managing. Nothing that requires your involvement. He paused. As of this morning, Marcus, you are out. The words sat in the room. Out. Not temporarily. Not contingently. Not with the footnotes and qualifications that Marcus had attached to every previous version of that word when they had discussed it. Just out. The thing that had been his life for 15 years, that had been his father's life before that had organized everything about who he was in the world and how the world understood him, was finished. He sat with that for a long moment. Elena watched him. She had been watching for this moment since Indiana. This specific moment, the one where the reality of the exit landed differently than the intention of it. She had been watching for the regret or the resistance. She did not see regret. She saw something that looked with a clarity that surprised her, like relief. He said, thank you, Reed. Reed said, it was my privilege. He meant it. After Reed left, the room was quiet again. Ellie was making the small sounds of a sleeping newborn. Marcus was looking at his daughter, and Elena was looking at him, and outside the window, the winter dark of the second day of February held itself over Chicago. Elena said I spoke to Dr. Wren this morning. He looked at her. She said her daughter's procedure is scheduled for the first week of March. The funding is arranged through the foundation's legal structure. She knows it came from us. She wanted me to tell you something. He waited. Elena said, she said she is sorry, not for calling you, for not calling you sooner. She had been watching the hospital record system for 3 months before Elena arrived, and she spent those 3 months hoping she would never have to make that call. And she eventually understood that the hoping was not about Elena's privacy. It was about her own comfort. She said she is sorry for that distinction. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she should have called sooner. Elena said, I know, but she was there in the safe house, and she has been there every step of this. He nodded. He accepted that. She said people make impossible choices under impossible conditions. We both know something about that. He said yes. She said the foundation is going to exist specifically because of that. Because the conditions that force impossible choices on people can be changed if someone decides to change them. That is what I am going to do. That is what I want to spend the next part of my life doing. He said, I know. She said, and you are going to run the legitimate businesses and fund it and be Ellie's father and be whatever version of yourself you are still figuring out how to be. She said it without sentimentality, just as a description of the future they were constructing. That is enough. That is more than enough. But you should know that I am not doing this because of you or for you. I am doing it because of what I survived, and for every woman who is currently surviving something similar without the specific luck I had of landing on my feet. He said I would not want it any other way. She looked at him. She held his gaze for a moment with a slightly different quality than all the times before it. She said, I am going to need you to understand something. She said it carefully. What happened to us? What we went through to get here? That is not a love story the way that stories tell love stories. There was no misunderstanding to clear up. There was no moment where everything was fine if we had just talked earlier. You killed a man in a kitchen. I left. Those things were real. The things that followed them were real. We are here because we both chose to be here with our eyes open, not because it was easy or inevitable or written somewhere. He said, I know. She said, I need you to keep knowing it. Not just now, every day. I need us to keep knowing it together. He said, that I can do. She said, good. Ellie stirred in the bassinet. Elena reached for her, the motion already becoming fluent, the adjustment and the lift and the cradling, that the body learns faster than the mind. She held her daughter and looked at her face in the dim light. She thought about a bus station on West Harrison Street and $200 in a tip jar, and a woman alone in a gas station bathroom with a pregnancy test. She thought about motels and diners and a concrete floor in a tunnel at 4 in the morning. She thought about a cursor blinking in a password field and 7 minutes on a clock and a bulletin board in a green room on Michigan Avenue. She thought about a man holding a gun that he had dropped without knowing he was dropping it. She had not come back because she was forgiven or because she had forgiven. She had not come back because love was sufficient explanation for complicated things. She had come back because she had decided that there was more courage in staying and building than in leaving and surviving, and that the distinction between those two things was something she wanted Ellie to understand by watching her mother live it. That was the story she was writing, not the one that had been handed to her, the one she was choosing. Spring came in March that year early, and tentative the way Illinois springs come advancing and retreating over a period of weeks before finally committing. The farmhouse fields turned from their winter dark to the first pale green of new growth. The oak trees at the property edge that had been bare since November began to find their edges again, the green that is only the green of very early leaves, not the full green of summer, but the green of something that has survived and is beginning again. Elena had an office in the farmhouse. She had claimed a room on the ground floor that had 2 windows looking onto the back garden and enough wall space for the filing system she was building for the foundation. She worked in it every morning from 7 until Ellie required her, and she worked in it again in the afternoons when Ellie slept. Reed had introduced her to a lawyer who specialized in nonprofit structures. Audrey Sloan had turned out to have a background in social services administration she had not mentioned, and that Elena had discovered by accident when reorganizing documents. She had asked Audrey about it directly, and Audrey had confirmed all of it and was now working with the foundation part-time. It suited her in the way that work suits people when it is connected to something they actually believe in. Dr. Wren's daughter had her surgery in the first week of March. It went well. Dr. Wren called Elena to tell her, and the call had been brief and formal, in the way of calls between people who share a complicated history and are in the process of finding the terms of something new. Elena thanked her for calling. Dr. Wren said she hoped the foundation found the support it needed. It was a beginning. The first woman the foundation helped was named Claire, 27 years old, 8 months pregnant, living in a shelter in Rockford after leaving a situation in Iowa that Elena did not ask her to detail and that Claire offered only in fragments over several weeks. The foundation paid for her prenatal care in a transitional housing arrangement and the specific practical support of someone checking in regularly and asking what she needed rather than telling her what she should do. Elena drove to Rockford twice. She did not send representatives. She went herself, which Marcus said nothing about, and which Audrey Sloan said simply, "Good. That is the right way to do it." On a Sunday afternoon in late March, Marcus was in the back garden with Ellie, who was 7 weeks old and had developed opinions about being outside that were emphatic and consistent. He was walking her along the stone path between the dormant flower beds, which were beginning to show the first signs of spring ambition, and she was looking at the world with the intensity of a person who has been in it for 7 weeks and is still working out its basic structure. Elena was watching from the back steps. She had a cup of coffee in the afternoon light and the sight of her daughter being carried by her father along a garden path in the first real warmth of an Illinois spring. She was not looking for the exits. She noticed this the way you notice the absence of a sound you have been so accustomed to hearing that its absence is itself a kind of sound. For 6 months, she had woken every morning running the automatic calculation. Where am I? What are the exits? What does today require? She had been running it at reduced intensity for the past several weeks. But it had still been there. It was not there now. This was not a permanent condition. She understood that. The vigilance that 6 months of survival had built into her was not going to dissolve in an afternoon just because the afternoon was beautiful. It would return. It would always be part of how she moved through the world, and she had decided to regard it as a resource rather than a symptom. The woman who had survived what she had survived was not a version of herself she wanted to leave behind. She was the person who had built this. She deserved to be part of what came next. But this afternoon on these steps, with the spring light doing what it does, and Ellie in the garden with her father, it was quiet. Marcus turned at the end of the path and came back toward the house, Ellie against his chest. He looked up and saw Elena on the steps, and something in his face opened up in the simple way of a man who sees the person he loves and does not perform the response but simply has it. She raised her coffee cup slightly in his direction. A small gesture. The gesture of two people who have built a language between them that does not require much to communicate the things that matter. He carried Ellie to the steps and sat down beside Elena, and the three of them were quiet in the spring afternoon for a while, the quiet of people who have come through something difficult and arrived somewhere real. The foundation's first public announcement would go out the following week. The farmhouse was in the process of becoming something between a temporary home and a permanent one, which they had not fully resolved and which Elena thought did not need to be resolved immediately. There was work to do and a daughter to raise, and a spring that was committing finally to being spring, and those things were sufficient for today. She had not arrived at the end of something. She had arrived at the beginning of a particular kind of work, the work of building a life that was chosen rather than inherited, that carried the weight of what it had cost without being defined only by that weight. Ellie made a sound suggesting she had a perspective on the afternoon she wanted to share. Marcus shifted her slightly, and she settled and was quiet again, her dark eyes finding the movement of new leaves in the oak trees at the property edge. Elena looked at her daughter, looking at the world. She had survived. She had come back. She had chosen. The spring held itself around the farmhouse, around the fields going green around the three of them, on the steps in the afternoon light. The oak trees moved in a small wind. The sky above Illinois was the particular blue of a late March afternoon that has finally decided to be what you have been waiting for it to be. It was enough. It was in the way of things that have been truly earned more than enough.